El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, but its history is anything but small. Stretching along the Pacific coast, it sits between Guatemala to the northwest and Honduras to the northeast, with no Caribbean shoreline. Its capital, San Salvador, is the country's political, economic, and cultural center, and the wider metropolitan area dominates national life. As of 2024, the country's population was estimated at around 6 million people. On a map, El Salvador can look compact and easy to summarize. But inside that small territory is a dense story of indigenous civilizations, Spanish conquest, export booms, authoritarian rule, civil war, mass migration, and economic reinvention. Long before El Salvador existed as a republic, the region formed part of a wider Mesoamerican world. Archaeological evidence points to the presence of early civilizations, including the Olmecs, whose influence is associated with monuments dating back to around the first millennium BCE. Over time, Maya communities also shaped the region, leaving cultural, agricultural, and political legacies. Later, the Cuscatlecs became one of the most important groups in the area that would become El Salvador. Their society was rooted in farming, trade, and local political organization. This pre-colonial history matters because it reminds us that El Salvador was not an empty frontier waiting to be discovered. It was already home to organized communities with their own identities, economies, and relationships to the land. Spanish expansion reached the region in the early 16th century. In 1524, Spanish forces conquered the area as part of the broader imperial push through Central America. The territory was eventually incorporated into the Viceroyalty of New Spain, whose main administrative center was in Mexico City. But distance mattered. The Central American Isthmus was difficult to govern directly from Mexico, so Spain created the Captaincy General of Guatemala in 1609. This administrative division included the territory of modern El Salvador throughout the colonial period. Under Spanish rule, land, labor, and production were reorganized to serve imperial interests. Indigenous communities were disrupted, converted, taxed, and drawn into colonial economic systems that would shape inequality for centuries. Colonial El Salvador's economy developed around products that could be sold beyond the region. In the 16th century, Spanish authorities commercialized indigenous cacao production, especially around Isalca. Cacao was valuable in regional trade and became one of the early foundations of colonial wealth. Another important product was balsam, harvested from coastal ranges in areas such as La Libertad and Ahuachapan. These exports connected the territory to imperial markets, but the benefits were uneven. Wealth concentrated among colonial elites and landholders, while indigenous and mixed communities often carried the burden of production. The pattern was clear. El Salvador's economy became deeply tied to export commodities, and that dependence would continue long after Spanish rule ended. In 1821, El Salvador and the rest of Central America declared independence from Spain. But independence did not immediately mean stable sovereignty. The region was briefly annexed by the First Mexican Empire, a short-lived political project that tried to bring former Spanish territories under one monarchy. El Salvador resisted this arrangement and, in 1823, joined the Federal Republic of Central America. The federation was an ambitious attempt to unite the isthmus under one political system, but internal divisions, regional rivalries, and ideological conflicts weakened it. By 1841, the federation had dissolved, and El Salvador emerged as a fully sovereign republic. Its independence was therefore not one clean moment, but a turbulent process of separation, experimentation, and political fragmentation. After independence, El Salvador faced the challenge of building a state while remaining economically dependent on exports. In the 19th century, indigo became the country's leading export because of global demand for natural dyes. Indigo production enriched landowners and merchants, but it also reinforced social hierarchies and dependence on foreign markets. When synthetic dyes later reduced the global importance of natural indigo, El Salvador shifted toward coffee. By the early 20th century, coffee dominated the economy so heavily that at its peak it generated roughly 90% of national export revenues. Coffee brought infrastructure, trade links, and wealth, but it also deepened land concentration. A powerful elite controlled much of the best land, while many rural people remained poor, landless, or dependent on seasonal labor. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were also marked by political instability. El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua even attempted to reunite in the Greater Republic of Central America between 1896 and 1898, but the union lasted only a short time. At home, politics were often dominated by military coups, authoritarian governments, and conflicts between elite factions. The state tended to protect the export economy and the interests of those who controlled land and commerce. This created a brittle political system. Economic growth existed, but it did not translate into broad social inclusion. Over time, the gap between wealthy landholding groups and poorer rural and urban communities became one of the central tensions in Salvadoran national life. By the mid-20th century, the underlying problems had become harder to contain. El Salvador experienced repeated unrest, political repression, and struggles over reform. Many citizens demanded more democratic participation, better labor rights, and solutions to inequality. But authoritarian rule and military influence limited peaceful channels for change. The country's small territory made land scarcity especially intense, and unequal land ownership left many families with few economic options. These pressures did not appear overnight. They were the result of decades of concentrated wealth, restricted politics, and social exclusion. As opposition movements grew and the state responded with force, the conditions for a much larger conflict began to form. From 1979 to 1992, El Salvador was consumed by civil war. The conflict was fought between the military-led government and the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN, a coalition of left-wing guerrilla groups. The war reflected deep domestic grievances, but it also unfolded during the Cold War, when conflicts in Latin America were often shaped by global ideological rivalries. For ordinary Salvadorans, the war meant violence, displacement, fear, and economic disruption. Communities were divided, and many families were forced to leave their homes. The conflict became one of the defining events in modern Salvadoran history because it transformed the political system, reshaped society, and left scars that continued long after the fighting stopped. The war ended in 1992 with the Chapultepec Peace Accords. These agreements were more than a ceasefire. They created a framework for transforming the country's institutions. The opposition was demilitarized, meaning the FMLN transitioned from an armed movement into legal political participation. Security forces were reformed, and the country moved toward a multi-party constitutional republic. The peace accords did not instantly solve poverty, inequality, or insecurity, but they changed the rules of political life. Instead of military confrontation, competition would take place through elections and civilian institutions. For a country shaped by coups and authoritarian rule, this was a major turning point. The Civil War and its economic aftermath also produced one of the most important social changes in modern El Salvador: mass emigration. Between 1980 and 2008, nearly 1 million Salvadorans migrated to the United States. Many left to escape violence, but others were pushed by economic instability and limited opportunities after the war. By 2008, Salvadorans had become the sixth largest immigrant population in the United States. This migration reshaped both countries. In the U.S., Salvadoran communities built new lives, businesses, churches, and cultural networks. In El Salvador, families became transnational, with relatives spread across borders. Money sent home by migrants became an important support system for many households. Economically, El Salvador gradually moved away from its old dependence on coffee. Manufacturing expanded, trade partnerships broadened, and financial links became more important. The country tried to diversify so that its prosperity would not rest on a single crop or a single export market. One of the most dramatic economic decisions came in 2001, when El Salvador replaced the colón, its national currency since 1892, with the United States dollar. Dollarization aimed to bring monetary stability, encourage investment, and reduce exchange rate risk, especially given the country's close economic ties with the United States. But it also meant giving up control over national monetary policy, making the Salvadoran economy even more connected to external conditions. Today, El Salvador is a country defined by both resilience and contradiction. It has one of Central America's smaller territories and around 6 million people, yet its influence extends far beyond its borders through migration and diaspora communities. It has reduced its historical reliance on coffee, but international assessments have still ranked it among the less complex market systems for commercial enterprise. Late 2010s indicators also showed relatively low income inequality compared with some Central American neighbors, even though social and economic challenges remained significant. To understand El Salvador is to see how geography, empire, export economies, war, migration, and reform all connect. Its story is not simply one of crisis. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and a small nation repeatedly forced to reinvent itself. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.